My name is David Fleming from Disciples Ignited, a ministry that's focused on Jesus, advancing his kingdom, and preparing his disciples. Now, we've been studying the Lord's altar and what that means for our own personal lives and how it always reveals Jesus to us in greater revelation. Now, this week we've been studying Psalm 118, verse 27, which is a very interesting verse, and how it ties together the Lord, his presence, his light with the altar. Let's start out by reading that together from the New American Standard Version. The Lord is God, and he has given us light. Bind the festival sacrifice to the horns of the altar with cords. Now, what we want to focus in today is what these horns were on the altar. Now, the horns were projections at the very top of the brazen altar where they made sacrifices to the Lord. And the horns were part of the altar itself. They weren't add-ons. They were part of the construction of the altar. Now, what the horns did is they enabled the priest to tie down the sacrifice that was going to be offered to the Lord. Now, remember, when you brought the lamb or the bull or the goats and you were going to offer them as a sacrifice to the Lord, they were alive. And so you brought them to the altar, and being able to tie them to the altar kept them put and united them to the altar so that you could actually make the sacrifice to the Lord. Because let's face it, those animals don't want to die, and so they're going to do their best to get away. Well, what does that have to do with us? It's very interesting. In other words, if we're walking with Jesus in his light, he's always going to be taking us to the altar, which we know, which we studied in previous videos, is representative of the cross. As Jesus said, if anyone would come after me, he must take up his cross daily and follow me. Now, the altar, the cross, always speaks to us of death, dying to ourselves, dying to our own will, dying to our own ways. And the horns of the altar says that we are going to be bound to the altar. Why is that important? Because when we come to the altar, remember, we are living sacrifices. And there are going to be many times that we're going to want to pull away from the altar. We're going to want to pull away from the things that are causing us to die to ourselves, die to our own will. We want our way, don't we? We want our plans to be fulfilled. But the cross, the altar, is all about dying to ourselves. And so the Lord is going to use certain things, certain circumstances to bind us to the altar. What do I mean by this? Well, let me explain it this way. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 and 10, a couple of verses that really explain this very well. He said, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore," Paul wrote, "I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." You know, in my walk with Jesus, I've been walking with him for over 50 years. And I have found that the Lord has allowed circumstances to come into my life. He has even allowed me to suffer weaknesses and hardships and difficulties that I would much rather have not had to go through. But yet, those things, those weaknesses, those hardships, those difficulties, they were God's way of binding me to the altar, of making me depend upon him. I didn't know how to deal with certain things. I didn't know how to deal with these weaknesses in my life. And so they made me cry out to Jesus all the more, "Lord, I need your help. I need your grace." You, my friend, may have certain circumstances in your life that you've been praying about for a long time, and you say, "Lord, why don't you just get rid of these things?" But let's begin to look at them with a different eternal perspective. Those things might be in your life binding you to the cross, keeping you reliant, dependent, upon Jesus. If that's what it's doing, it's a good thing. That's why Paul says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, because when I'm weak, then I'm strong. Think about that. And join me tomorrow as we study more about the Lord's altar. I'll see you then.